So now we're going to move on to another seminal moment in not just American history and not just the history of Japan, but the history of the world. And Susan Southard's book, Nagasaki, Life After Nuclear War, is about the... I went to Japan on a Japan Society Fellowship about 20 years ago, but I'm still going to pronounce this wrong. The Hibakusha. Is that the way you pronounce it?
It's Hibakusha.
Hibakusha.
There you go.
Okay. Hibakusha, who are the survivors of the nuclear bomb. And like Steve, you focus on a few characters to tell your story, and your narrative moves forward through Taniguchi Nagano is a woman, Do-o is a woman, Yoshida and Wada. How did you find them?
Well, I knew Mr. Taniguchi first before I began the book. Back in 1986, I lived in Washington, D.C., and I went to hear him speak. He was on a speaking tour. And I don't remember how it unfolded, but I think I must have given him my business card, because the next day I got a call asking if I could step in and be his interpreter for the final 2 days he was in D.C. And it was quite a life-transforming 2 days for me, because he spoke no English, so reading his English the translations of his his Japanese presentations was easy. He would say something and then I would read the English, but in all of the time in between, hours and hours and hours of time we had together, I got to talk with him and ask him about his life. He was 57 then, and it was phenomenal.
And did he lead you to some of the other characters you used?
Actually, no. I went to Nagasaki the following year to see him, and I met some survivors then, but it wasn't, I wasn't working on the book yet. And I stayed in touch with him a little bit over the years. When I decided to write the book in 2003, I knew he would be a character, and I contacted him again. But I contacted the Nagasaki Atomic Bomb Museum, the Nagasaki National Peace Memorial Hall, and an organization called the Nagasaki Foundation for the Promotion of Peace, to try to find survivors I could interview. And so I did. That in 2003, I met 2 more survivors, Mrs. Do and Mr. Wada. And then I collected hundreds of testimonies. And as I got to know the story more of what was happening beneath the atomic bomb and in the years as it followed, I knew that there were other kinds of stories I needed in order to at least give some representation of, 5 people doesn't represent the experiences of hundreds of thousands of people, but I was trying to get a family story, and I was trying to get Mr. Yoshida, the final one, was the youngest. He was 13. And Mrs. Nagano had an amazing story of her family, what happened to her and her family in the aftermath of the bombing.
Now, I know you run a theater and you have other things to do, but 13 years, that's a pretty long time. You're almost on the Robert Caro plan.
Thank you.
How many trips, because it was a big project, I mean, how many trips
12
did
years.
you have to...
It's bad enough that it was 12. That's not...
How many trips did you take to Japan?
Talk to my editor.
And that is a very, very difficult thing to do, to research something in a different language. I know you used a number of interpreters, even though you also speak Japanese. But how many times did you go there? Did you live there?
For the book, I went 5 times. To Nagasaki directly, and had all my interviews set up in advance, all my research. I interviewed many physicians and psychologists and historians and archivists, and spent a lot of time in the libraries there. I don't read and write Japanese well, so most of my sources were in English, except for the actual original sources, the interviews, which I did in Japanese.
You know, one of the things that I found really interesting about this book is how the U.S. basically tried to censor and prevent the truth from coming out. John Hersey was able to do a book about Hiroshima. It started as a New Yorker piece. But, you know, a reporter for the Chicago Tribune, for instance, got into Nagasaki, and what happened to his report?
Well, so when MacArthur entered Japan in September of 1945, he issued a Japanese press code, which basically, it never said that you couldn't talk about the bomb, but that media couldn't talk about the bomb. But there were so many rules that ultimately there was nothing that could be said publicly in the media about the atomic bombings. And so for the next 4 years, no one else, even in Japan, really knew what was going on in both Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So when George Weller,
That's the Tribune reporter.
That's the Tribune reporter. He snuck his way down. So all the American and European press were tightly controlled and were only allowed to go to certain places when they would come to Japan after the war. But he did and they were so he went on a certain little tiny junket to some really uninteresting place, but then he escaped and made his way down, and making his way. Nagasaki is far. It's at the western coast of the southernmost main island, and the trains were all destroyed. It took him a long time to get down to Nagasaki, and then he pretended to be an American official and lied his way to getting a lot of support by the officials in Nagasaki, the Japanese officials. But he had to submit his dispatches to the occupation censorship office, which everything had to go through, and they never passed through. And eventually, there's this amazing book. Eventually, a carbon copy of all of his writings were found in his home, and I think it's in Italy, and they were published a long time ago, like 5 years
It turns out that the Japanese surrender, when Hirohito went on the radio and surrendered, that it had nothing to do with Nagasaki. That you could argue that it had a lot to do with Hiroshima and with the Russians getting ready to intervene. But is it now pretty clear that Nagasaki was absolutely unnecessary when it came to ending World War II?
Oh, it's a big question. It's not as...
That's what we're here for.
I cannot say to that level of certainty that you're saying, Jonathan. It's somewhat close to that. But because a lot of Japanese military and governmental documents were destroyed between the surrender and the occupation, we don't have every record. But basically, there's no evidence for the records that we do have that the Nagasaki bomb had anything to do with the surrender, which happened 11 hours later. In fact, the Russian invasion of Manchuria, Japanese-held Manchuria, 11 hours before the Nagasaki bombing was one of the key things that was being heatedly discussed all day. And they found out about the Nagasaki bombing 30 minutes after it occurred, but it didn't come up in the debates of what to do. So I think it's close, but it's not, the door is not completely shut on it, only because it's a difficult assessment to fully make.
One of your characters says he doesn't hate Americans anymore, he just hates war. Mm-hmm. And is that, you think, the consensus among the Hibakusha?
It's hard for me to speak for all Hibakusha because I didn't, there's so many, both who have died in the years since the bombing and even who are alive now. But so I don't know. It is true amongst those I know. That's for sure.
So your characters, all of whom are still alive, would that be common for all of them? In other words, was there any hostility that you could detect when they were discussing this, or was it more just suffering?
Before I chose them as my final ones, when I was setting up interviews with a number of people, I did have one interview canceled. The woman decided she'd never met an American and she didn't want to. The interview was set up through, she was a childhood friend of somebody else I had interviewed, and the childhood friend said, told her you should have this interview, and then she canceled it. So it's not, I can't say across the board. And I just want to say, without spoiler alert closure, that not everyone is still alive in my book. Yeah, just for the record.
So the museum, there's a new museum at Nagasaki that's been built since I was there. At the time I was visiting, the museum at Hiroshima was less willing to contextualize than the museum in Nagasaki. In other words, Hiroshima, I don't think they mentioned Pearl Harbor. In Nagasaki, they had some context about Japanese militarism. What is your sense of how they are coming to terms with this part of their history, and also how Americans, and you make a point of this, that Americans have not really come to terms with this part, with the toll that the bomb took on human beings in our education system?
Well, one thing that was interesting, some of you may know about the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum debacle in 1995, when they were going to do an exhibit of the making and delivery of the bomb, and then also provide some photographs and artifacts for of the survivors and of survival in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And ultimately, the military rose up in protest, and the exhibit was shut down, except for the fuselage of the Enola Gay. So in Nagasaki, similarly, in 1996, the Nagasaki Atomic Bomb Museum was going to include more of its military atrocities in China, and it got slammed down by the more right-wing militaristic faction in the country. So it's unresolved in both countries to some degree. Again, it's hard for me to speak for an entire city, because the hibakusha are now in their, the youngest would be 71 this summer, and the oldest of the ones I know is 89, I think, or 90 now, and there's a whole number of generations that have followed, and they have, it's very much an anti-nuclear city, I would say, and all the children are educated. They have a peace education program in every school. It's very interesting. I went to be a part of it a few times. But I don't know that they've resolved their own, the great harm their nation caused, their military caused. In the same way, I don't think we have resolved it.
So in terms of the health effects, I believe you say at one point that if you were within 1 mile of ground zero, your chances of getting cancer were something like 50% or something of that, of that order?
I'm afraid I don't remember.
And,
oh my goodness, there were, like Steve was saying, there were so many aspects that I had to become very versed in for writing.
Is it fair to say that there was a lot of fear that there would be some congenital problems that resulted from the radiation, but that has not happened as much as there was fear of, but there was a tremendous amount of radiation, cancer as a result of radiation, leukemias and other kinds of cancers, and that as late as the 1960s, the American press was still buying the argument that that was not the case?
Well, and you're right when you said they have concentric circles around on maps from the hypocenter extending outward, and everything in the research in Japan and the United States after the war is by distance and by shielding, and it's quite a complicated factor of who got sick and who didn't, and a lot of it even then is arbitrary, it seemed. So yes. Well, I don't remember saying something about in the 1960s in the book.
I remembered it
What
because
was it?
I worked at Newsweek, and it was Time in U.S. News.
Oh yes.
Printed
Oh yes.
some kind of a study that said that
Yes.
there was no radiation, long-term radiation
Yes.
effects.
It's absolutely remarkable how blatant the denial was in this country. In the media, and how easy it is because of that, and because of the kind of official narrative that our government created about that the bomb, singular, ended the war and saved 1 million American lives, closed down the fact that for the people who survived the both bombings, the war never ended because they felt like they had been burned from the inside out.
If a certain what Spy magazine called short-fingered vulgarian becomes president of the United States, Japan may find itself under pressure to go nuclear. How do you think they would feel about having their own nuclear capability? And also, since we're talking about today, how do you think President Obama will be received when he goes to Hiroshima?
Well, first, I think President Obama will be very welcomed. That's my sense. I wish he would go to Nagasaki as well. And I think he's going to be very cautious in his remarks, so as to initiate as little controversy as possible. That's my sense of everything so far that's led up to today's announcement. As far as Japan getting a nuclear weapon, Japan is not a unilateral country, but generally speaking, the people really like their peace constitution that MacArthur's team wrote. And to me, it would be hard to imagine a nuclear weapon actually being built there, or if it did, it would be quite a while, I think. It's really beyond my imagination that Japan would actually, that the people would ultimately allow it.
So do the nationalists want it? They're right-wingers. Do they want to? I know they want to get out from under the peace constitution and militarize a little bit. Do they want nuclear weapons?
I'm afraid I don't know. I didn't study it well enough to be able to answer that correctly. But I'm guessing yes. They don't want to be dependent on the United States for that protection.